power and influence over others. That's how the Oxford Dictionary defines dominance. But in the context of MMA, how can dominance be defined? In order for us to debate who is the most dominant fighter in UFC history, we must first establish a definition. This is the simplest definition I could come up with, and it still leaves lots of room for interpretation. So perhaps an easier way to find out who's most dominant, we need a criteria. These will be the 5 factors which we evaluate our contenders around. Now that we understand our definition of dominance, let us find out who truly is the most dominant fighter in UFC history.
James Vick is the most dominant force in UFC history.
Our first candidate is Dana White's favorite fighter.
When are you gonna oil up Jon Jones?
Since we did not set the no PED users rule, Jon Jones has to be in contention. Becoming UFC champion at the tender age of 23, Jon Jones has been at the top of the sport for nearly 15 years. When going down our criteria, from 2008 to 2013, Jon Jones passes almost all the criteria with flying colors, only being tagged or put in trouble less than a handful of times, losing only 2 rounds, Machida round 1 and Evans round 1, and finishing 9 of his 13 bouts, with 5 of them being former UFC champions. Where it gets a little iffy for Jones's case as the most dominant fighter of all time is once the first Gustafsson fight happens. In one of the greatest fights in UFC history, we saw, at the time, the untouchable Jon Jones tested. There was nothing dominant about this performance, and since this bout, I could only qualify 5 of his last 10 bouts as dominant. It's also important to note that of those last 10 opponents, only 3 were former UFC champions, one of those being the ghost of Stipe Miocic. So if we were to look at his career to this point as a whole and give him a grading out of 20 for each of our criterias, it would look something like this. Lack of damage taken, got him at a 17. He's never been dropped or really hurt, but he has taken a good amount of damage. Rounds lost, got him at 17 out of 20. He lost rounds to, as I said, Machida and Evans, but then obviously losing rounds to Gustafsson the first time. He lost some rounds to Cormier. He lost rounds to Thiago Santos, Dominic Reyes. So we got him at 17 finishes, also a 17. In his 22 UFC wins, he has 12 finishes and 10 decisions. I think that's about like a 52% finish rate. So we got him at 17 there. Competition, 19 out of 20 because he's fought a lot of former UFC champions. I think he's at 12, 11 or something like that. And longevity, we've got him at 20 out of 20 because he has been at the top of the sport for, like I said, 15 years. All of that combined brings Jon Jones to a 90 overall in our dominance criteria. Once this idea came to mind, Khabib was the first person I thought of to make the list. The ego was an embodiment of what it was to be a dominant fighter. His style didn't give opponents a moment to find success, taking them down, controlling them, and putting an absolute beating on them. In Khabib's perfect 13-0 UFC career, he has never officially lost a round. He has had multiple 10-8 rounds, and in his fight against Edson Barbosa, one judge gave him 3 10-8 rounds, and the other gave him 2. When Khabib was having his way, which was practically all of the time, it was utter domination. The fact which perhaps displays his dominance the most is that in his entire career, Khabib was never even cut. To have never been cut in 29 professional MMA fights is a feat that no one has, and frankly no one will ever accomplish again. Where Khabib starts to falter in his argument as most dominant is in competition and longevity. He has only faced 2 former undisputed UFC champions, and because he retired very young, his longevity was never really put to the test. So for that, we have lack of damage taken at 20 out of 20, never being cut, never being dropped, tagged rarely. I'm thinking like once by Poirier, once by Gaethje. Rounds lost, he never officially lost a round. Yes, in the McGregor fight, judges scored the 3rd round for McGregor, most of them, but since that fight went to a decision, it wasn't officially a lost round. So He's never lost a round technically in 13 fights. And finishes, we have him tied with Jon Jones at 17. He has 7 finishes in 13 fights, and I think that percentage-wise is better than 12 in 22 UFC fights. His competition we have at a 17 with only 2 former undisputed champions on his resume. Of course, he's got the Gaethje and the Poirier wins, which are interim champions, and the longevity since he retired so young, only at a 17, but that does bring him to a 91 overall. An unfortunately often forgotten piece of UFC history is the career of Francis Ngannou. Some of you may be surprised at this pick, but I'm not making a top 4 most dominant. I just picked 4 fighters who I think were very dominant in their fighting style. Where Ngannou's dominance really shined was in his finishing ability. In his 12 UFC wins, he has 11 finishes. And as you know, if you have seen some Ngannou highlights, these aren't regular old TKO finishes. Francis Ngannou has a ridiculous 8 first-round finishes in his UFC career. Where Ngannou separates himself from other prolific finishers like Charles Oliveira and Derek Lewis is the fact that he only has 2 losses and has never been finished or even dropped. One of his losses he avenged in devastating fashion against Stipe Miocic, and that Derek Lewis fight should have counted as a loss for both fighters. Sadly, Ngannou's UFC career was cut short due to contract disputes between him and the company. Ngannou's desire to go find big money fights in boxing wasn't coinciding with the UFC's vision, and ultimately that led to Ngannou leaving the UFC after his first title defense against Cyril Gane. Who knows what Francis's career could have looked like had he stayed in the UFC, but since this is the career we have to judge, he will lose points on longevity. So for lack of damage taken, we have him at a 17. He did get beat up by Stipe in the first fight. Other than that, he never really got hurt. Rounds lost every single round in that Stipe fight. No one else on this list had been 5-0 dominated like Ngannou was against Stipe, so that's definitely bringing him down to a 17. His finishes, 20 out of 20, 12 fights and 11 finishes will do that, and 8 first-round finishes, just crazy. Competition, we have him at a 17. He has wins over Stipe, Kane, and JDS, as well as Arlovsky. Some of the champions that he beat were way past their prime, specifically JDS, Kane, and Arlovsky, but only 4 former UFC champions, unless I'm missing one. And the longevity obviously cut short because he left after his first title defense, but we have him at a 17, which brings him to an 88 overall. The Spider is a very curious case when it comes to dominance. He is the only fighter so far who definitely continued on fighting way past his prime. Because of that, his legacy is impacted, and it is difficult to look past those later performances, but for the case of this we must, because Anderson Silva in his prime was very dominant. However, that doesn't mean we don't take into account the latter part of his career into our judging. Silva was one of the best finishers in UFC history, having 14 victories by way of finish in his 17 wins. Silva's dominance didn't involve grappling like Khabib or Jones. He was able to dominate his opponents solely on the feet by practically never getting hit clean and landing pinpoint shots in return. In his bout against Forrest Griffin, Silva completely dominated the fight by making Forrest swing at air over and over. Silva made a former UFC champion look like he had never fought in his life. Then, he quickly dispensed of him in the first round with the most casual counterpunch I've ever seen. But like I said, Silva's later career is what really hurts his case as the most dominant ever. After he suffered his first loss to Chris Weidman, he would go 1-6-1, with 3 of those losses coming by finish. 2 were by leg injury, but still. Yes, he was way past his prime, but we did not set a rule to overlook the past prime years. So because of that, we have his damage taken, or lack of damage taken, at a 15. He was finished, unlike any of the other guys on this list. Rounds lost, we have it at 15. Obviously, with 6 losses, you're going to be losing some rounds. 20 on the finishing, because 14 finishes in 17 fights is extremely impressive, especially in the middleweight division. We have his competition at a 19 because he has fought, I think, just as many UFC champions as Jones did. Of course, he lost to some of them like Adesanya and Cormier and Weidman, but you still got to take that into account. And we have his longevity at an 18 because he fought for a long time, but he didn't dominate for a long time. He dominated longer than Inganu and Khabib, because you think of those two guys, they have 12 wins and 13 wins, but Silva had 16 wins in a row, and that was a little bit more longevity of dominance. So we have him at an 18, and that brings him to an 87 overall. So with 4 fighters evaluated, we have come to a conclusion that Khabib Nurmagomedov is the most dominant fighter ever, with an overall of 91. If you think I missed anyone who should be on the list, let me know in the comments. And if you disagree with my grading, leave a comment. Let's have some dominance debates down below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and till next time.